Vietnam was under French control since the 1880s as part of French Indochina. The Vietnamese people wanted to be free from foreign rule. After World War II, Ho Chi Minh, a communist leader, declared Vietnam independent in 1945, but the French tried to take control again. This made many Vietnamese people angry. The French were finally defeated at Dien Bien Phu in 1954. After this, Vietnam was split into two parts at the 17th parallel. North Vietnam was led by Ho Chi Minh and was communist. South Vietnam was led by Ngo Dinh Diem and was supported by the United States. The split was supposed to be temporary until elections could be held, but the elections never happened. The United States was worried about communism spreading in Southeast Asia. This fear was called the domino theory. If one country fell to communism, nearby countries would also fall like dominoes. The Cold War between the United States and Soviet Union made the situation worse. The Soviet Union and China supported North Vietnam with weapons and supplies. The United States started sending military advisors to South Vietnam in the early 1950s to help fight against the communists. By 1961, the conflict was growing as more American advisors arrived. The war had its roots in both Vietnamese desire for independence and the global fight between communism and capitalism. The United States slowly got more involved in Vietnam. At first, they only sent advisors to help South Vietnam fight the communists. President Kennedy increased the number of advisors in the early 1960s. But everything changed after the Gulf of Tonkin incident in August 1964. American ships reported being attacked by North Vietnamese boats. The second attack probably never happened, but the U.S. government used this event to get more involved in the war. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which gave President Johnson the power to use military force in Vietnam without declaring war. This was a turning point that led to much bigger U.S. involvement. In 1965, the first American combat troops arrived in Vietnam. The number of U.S. soldiers in Vietnam grew very quickly. By 1969, more than 500,000 American troops were in Vietnam. The United States also started bombing North Vietnam in an operation called Rolling Thunder. The goal was to stop North Vietnam from supporting communist fighters in the South. The American government told the public that the war was going well and would end soon. But the reality on the ground was very different, and the war would last much longer than anyone expected. The Vietnam War was fought in a very different way from earlier wars. American soldiers faced a tough enemy who knew the land well. The Viet Cong were guerrilla fighters who hid in the jungle and set traps. They dug tunnels and used surprise attacks. The North Vietnamese army was also strong and determined. American troops used helicopters to move quickly around the country. This was called air mobility and was tested in the Battle of Ia Drang Valley in 1965. This battle showed how the war would be fought. The U.S. used its superior firepower, including bombs, artillery, and helicopters. But the enemy would fight at close range to make American weapons less effective. The jungle made fighting very hard. It was hot, wet, and full of dangers like snakes and diseases. Soldiers couldn't always tell who was an enemy and who was a friend. Many villages had both civilians and hidden Viet Cong fighters. The U.S. military used a strategy called search and destroy to find and kill enemy troops. They also used chemicals like Agent Orange to remove leaves from trees so they could see the enemy better. The fighting was brutal and confusing. American soldiers measured success by counting dead enemy bodies, which was called a body count. But this was not a good way to measure progress in the war. The Tet Offensive was one of the most important events of the Vietnam War. It started on January 30th, 1968, during Tet, a Vietnamese holiday celebrating the New Year. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong attacked many cities and towns across South Vietnam at the same time. They even attacked the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. The attack surprised the Americans and South Vietnamese. Before Tet, American leaders had been saying the war was going well. The Tet Offensive showed that the enemy was still very strong. The fighting was especially bad in the city of Hue, where thousands died. The battle to take back Hue lasted a month and left the city in ruins. In military terms, the Tet Offensive was a defeat for the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong. They lost about 45,000 fighters, while the Americans and South Vietnamese lost fewer soldiers. But in terms of public opinion, Tet was a victory for North Vietnam. Americans watching the war on television were shocked by the violence. Many began to doubt what their government was telling them about the war. President Johnson's approval rating for handling the war dropped to just 32%. The Tet Offensive was a turning point that changed how many Americans viewed the war. After Tet, support for the war began to fall, and pressure to end it grew stronger. As the war got bigger, many Americans started protests against it. The protests began in 1965, when U.S. combat troops first arrived in Vietnam. College students were often the leaders of these protests. They organized teach-ins, sit-ins, and marches. Some young men burned their draft cards to show they would not fight in the war. The draft made the protests bigger because many young men did not want to be forced to fight in a war they didn't believe in. By 1969, the anti-war movement had grown very large. On October 15, 1969, about 15 million Americans took part in protests across the country in what was called a moratorium to end the war in Vietnam. It was the largest single-day protest in U.S. history at that time. A month later, over 500,000 people rallied in Washington, D.C. The protesters had different reasons for opposing the war. Some thought the war was morally wrong. Others believed the U.S. should not interfere in another country's civil war. Many were upset about the high number of American soldiers dying. The protests sometimes turned violent, and there were clashes with police. Not all Americans supported the protesters. Many people thought the protesters were unpatriotic or disrespectful to the troops. The anti-war movement created deep divisions in American society that lasted for many years. The Vietnam War was the first war to be shown on television every night. This had a big impact on how Americans saw the war. Reporters and camera crews went to Vietnam and showed the real face of war. They filmed battles, wounded soldiers, and destroyed villages. These images came into American homes during the evening news. People could see the horror of war in a way they never could before. Some powerful photos changed how people felt about the war. One showed a South Vietnamese police officer shooting a Viet Cong suspect in the head. Another showed a young girl running naked after being burned by napalm. These images shocked many Americans. At first, most news reports supported the war. But after the Tet Offensive in 1968, reporters began to question what the government was saying. The gap between official statements and what journalists saw with their own eyes grew larger. This made many Americans lose trust in their government. President Johnson once said, "If I've lost Walter Cronkite, I've lost Middle America," after the famous news anchor criticized the war. The media did not cause the U.S. to lose the war, but it did help change public opinion. By bringing the war into people's living rooms, television made the conflict more real and more troubling for many Americans. The Vietnam War had many dark moments, but one of the worst was the My Lai massacre. On March 16, 1968, American soldiers killed hundreds of unarmed Vietnamese civilians in the village of My Lai. The victims were mostly women, children, and old men. Some were praying when they were shot. Others were pushed into ditches and killed. The soldiers were from Charlie Company, led by Lieutenant William Calley. They had been told that My Lai was full of Viet Cong fighters, but they found only civilians. The massacre was covered up at first. It only became public more than a year later, when a soldier named Ron Ridenour wrote letters to government officials. Photos taken by an Army photographer named Ron Heberl showed the horror of what happened. When Americans learned about My Lai, many were shocked and ashamed. Lieutenant Calley was the only person convicted of a crime for the massacre. He was found guilty of killing 22 civilians and sentenced to life in prison, but he only served 3.5 years under house arrest. My Lai was not the only war crime in Vietnam, but it was the most famous. The brutal nature of the war led to other terrible acts on both sides. The Viet Cong also killed civilians they thought supported the South Vietnamese government. The My Lai massacre made many Americans question the morality of the war and what it was doing to their country's values. As the war dragged on, pressure grew to find a way out. Peace talks began in Paris in May 1968. The United States, North Vietnam, South Vietnam, and the Viet Cong all sent representatives. But the talks moved very slowly because both sides wanted different things. The U.S. wanted North Vietnamese troops to leave South Vietnam. North Vietnam wanted all U.S. troops to leave and the South Vietnamese government to be replaced. While the talks continued, the fighting went on. When Richard Nixon became president in 1969, he started a policy called Vietnamization. This meant training South Vietnamese troops to take over the fighting so American soldiers could come home. Nixon also began to reduce the number of U.S. troops in Vietnam. At the same time, he expanded the war by bombing and sending troops into Cambodia in 1970. This caused more protests in the United States. The peace talks finally made progress in 1972. Henry Kissinger, representing the U.S., and Lưu Duc Tho, representing North Vietnam, worked out an agreement. The Paris Peace Accords were signed on January 27, 1973. They called for a ceasefire, the release of American prisoners of war, and the withdrawal of all U.S. troops. The last American combat troops left Vietnam on March 29, 1973. But the agreement did not bring true peace to Vietnam. Fighting between North and South Vietnam continued after the Americans left. After American troops left Vietnam in 1973, South Vietnam tried to fight on alone. The United States still sent money and weapons, but Congress cut this aid by 30% in 1974. Without enough support, South Vietnam's army became weaker. North Vietnam, meanwhile, was planning a final attack. In early 1975, North Vietnamese forces began a major offensive. They quickly captured many cities and moved toward Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam. The South Vietnamese army could not stop them. By April 1975, North Vietnamese troops surrounded Saigon. Many South Vietnamese people who had worked with the Americans tried to escape. They feared what would happen when the communists took over. The U.S. Embassy organized a massive evacuation called Operation Frequent Wind. Helicopters landed on the embassy roof and other locations to pick up Americans and some Vietnamese. It was the largest helicopter evacuation in history. On April 30th, 1975, North Vietnamese tanks crashed through the gates of the presidential palace in Saigon. South Vietnam surrendered, and the Vietnam War was over. The communists renamed Saigon as Ho Chi Minh City, after their revolutionary leader. The fall of Saigon was a humiliating defeat for the United States. After years of fighting and billions of dollars spent, America had failed to save South Vietnam from communism. The images of desperate people trying to escape Saigon became powerful symbols of America's failure in Vietnam. The Vietnam War left deep scars on both Vietnam and the United States. In Vietnam, millions of people died during the war. Many more were wounded or lost their homes. The country's land and forests were damaged by bombs and chemicals like Agent Orange. After the war, many South Vietnamese who had supported the Americans were sent to re-education camps. Millions of Vietnamese fled the country as refugees, often in small boats. Many died at sea trying to escape. In the United States, about 58,000 American soldiers died in the war. More than 150,000 were wounded. Many veterans had trouble when they came home. Unlike soldiers from World War II, Vietnam veterans were not always welcomed as heroes. Some faced anger from people who opposed the war. Many suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, and other health problems. The war changed how Americans viewed their government. People became more skeptical of what leaders told them. The Vietnam Syndrome made Americans reluctant to get involved in foreign wars for many years. The military learned lessons from Vietnam about how to fight guerrilla wars and how to maintain public support. Relations between the United States and Vietnam remained hostile for years after the war. But in 1995, the countries established diplomatic relations. Today, they work together on issues like trade and finding the remains of soldiers missing in action. The Vietnam War remains a painful memory, but both countries have tried to heal the wounds of the past.